Hello, and welcome back to the channel for a brand new video, and possibly the start of a new series as well, depending on how this first video goes down. Basically, like a lot of other fans at the moment, I would imagine, since the news came out about David Tennant and Catherine Tate returning for the 6th anniversary next year, I'm on a bit of a little nostalgia trip back to 2008 and to Series 4, my first series, incidentally, as well, the year that I got into Doctor Who. And I'm basically having a bit of a Series 4 rewatch, going back to some of these episodes which I haven't seen in quite some time, actually, for quite a few of them. And so basically, I thought I might as well just share some of my thoughts on here, on the channel, along the way on each episode, because, like I say, I haven't really seen quite a few of them for quite some time, and also I just haven't really talked about them on the channel that much either. I haven't done like a proper review or anything for quite a few Doctor Who episodes, so if that's something you'd like to see more of in the future, do let me know. But for the time being, for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus on the first 3 episodes, the opening 3 episodes of Series 4. Volume 1, if you like, harking back to the days of the old DVD volumes, the episodes that are included in that first volume. So Partners in Crime, The Fires of Pompeii, and Planet of the Ood. So let's just get straight into it, really, with Partners in Crime, the opening episode of the series, obviously. Technically, the first episode of Doctor Who that I actually sat down and watched all the way through, the episode that got me into the show, essentially, after picking up a couple of issues of Doctor Who Adventures magazine in the weeks leading up to Series 4's broadcast. That is how I got into the show, period. That's what it was. And they deserve a bit of a mention, a bit of a shout out as well, actually, because, in the days, before we all had smartphones, and, I was only like 7 years old back at this point, so, in those old innocent days of childhood, back before we could just access all this information on the internet, spoilers, filming, photos, whatever, forums, Twitter, it was all out of my reach, and I imagine that was the same case for a lot of other people my age as well. So Doctor Who Adventures, literally was the main source for Doctor Who news and news about upcoming episodes and stuff like that. So, those covers in particular, for this episode, I think the week before it went out, there was like one with a red background and the Doctor and Donna and Miss Foster. And then the week afterwards, there was one with the Doctor putting a sonic screwdriver and a lot of adipose surrounding him. I think for the Fires of Pompeii, there was one with like Donna front and centre. And then for Planet of the Ood, you had an Ood front and centre as well, like with purple trim and borders and stuff. I remember those issues so well. I do still have all of them, actually. I went back the other day to look at them, and unfortunately they are a bit worse for wear. They're sort of falling apart a bit. They've been cut up and stuff to make like posters and collages and stuff, stuff you do when you're a kid. And I sort of wish I could have that experience of buying them for the first time again and reading them for the first time again, because they were just such a massive part of that experience, and they're sort of forever intertwined with my experience of watching this series go out for the first time. But on to the episode itself, because that was a little bit of a preamble, really. I was meaning to talk about Partners in Crime, got a bit sidetracked. But yeah, Partners in Crime is such a tight opening episode, such a tight script, I think. It's an episode which, over the years, I haven't necessarily sort of enjoyed as much as I do now. I think it is tempting to look at it from the point of view of, it's an episode set in like an office block for quite a bit of it, and set at night and stuff. It's perhaps a little bit sort of uninteresting from a visual point of view. There's not a lot going on in that regard necessarily. And also in terms of the monster as well, the adipose are a gimmicky monster. They just kind of tick that box. But they're not as much of a sort of big, imposing, sort of bam-in-your-face threat as something like the Jadoon, for instance, like a more humanoid monster. They are very much more a gimmick, like I say, I suppose, and something which is taken as a bit of a joke as well and made fun of, and they're like, a cute little thing, and they're not really monsters anyway. So I guess from that point of view, you could perhaps say, well, it's different, isn't it? It's not quite, what you'd expect. But, as the years go on, these things are less and less of a problem for me, because I just think it's such a tight script. I think the way that, right from the opening scene, it's just all about the Doctor and Donna sort of slowly like converging and their paths meeting, by the midpoint of the episode or whatever. And basically, that first 20-25 minutes or so is just building to the moment of their reunion. And I think, while it does help to have that knowledge and backstory of, who Donna is and where she came from, and having seen Runaway Bride and stuff, I hadn't seen Runaway Bride when this originally went out. And I think actually as well, putting yourself in that frame of mind of someone watching this for the first time, watching Doctor Who for the first time, you don't really need to know too much about Donna coming into this, because, you know, it's all handed to you there on a plate. You know, you see her relationship with her mum and with her granddad, and how she's basically just like trying to escape the mundanity of life, I suppose, and do something more with herself, and has all these regrets as she's approaching this point in her life as well, I suppose, and just wants to see the Doctor again. So, you know, all of that really works, and there's a really great sense of anticipation, I think, you know, culminating in that moment of their reunion, like I say, which just feels so earned and is such a fantastic moment. I mean, I do think a massive amount of what makes this episode work is just all the stars aligning, really, you know, because it was never a given that Donna was going to come back, that Catherine Tate would want to do it again. You know, she was just a one-off character to all intents and purposes. And we could very easily have been in that situation again, where we were getting a brand new, young female companion for Series 4. And I'm sure that would have been great, but it wouldn't have had the same impact as, bringing Donna back. So I do think, because that was something which wasn't planned necessarily, it wasn't planned at all at a certain stage, it is a slight thing, I guess, of, like I say, stars aligning and luck and things falling into place. And that's not a criticism, it's just an observation, I think, of how, they were fortunate that they were in this situation and in this place where this happened, and we got Donna back. And like I say, it just adds so much weight to this episode and the series as a whole, I think. I do think script-wise, this is the tightest of the opening 3 episodes. Like I say, I think it is my favourite, from that point of view, going back to them now, which, surprised me as much as anyone else, that this is my favourite episode. But, yeah, it's just really strong, really great fun, absolutely love it. Then we move on to the Fires of Pompeii. So, the second episode, obviously, Donna's first trip back in time. I think from that point of view, it does well, and this is probably the strongest part of the story, the strongest aspect. It does well with developing Donna as a character and sort of right from the off showing her the harsh or somewhat harsh reality of life in the TARDIS. It's not just all fun and games. You could be forgiven for thinking so after that rather light-hearted series opener, but no, the reality is a lot more complicated than that. And I think that is definitely the strongest part of this story and the strongest aspect. And I think, for Donna and for her character developments, it does well in that regard. I mean, it's one of those stories that's always had quite a lot of hype surrounding it, and, even more so in the years since because of, Karen Gillan and then Peter Capaldi both, subsequently being cast after appearances in this story. So from that point of view, it is one that's worth going back to, and also it has, the whole sort of thing of the fires of Pompeii, the eruption of Vesuvius, and the whole thing with a fixed point, and how that ties into 10th Doctor's arc with What Was a Mars and Time of Victorious and all that sort of stuff. But I do think, going back to it this time, it has come down in my estimations just a little bit. And I think it's partially down to the fact that we've had a story like Rosa, since this episode went out. A story which plays with very similar ideas, having that fixed point, we can't change the past. I do think in that story, because you have, companions of colour in the TARDIS team in Rosa, and because, you have, like, Graham ending up being the person who forces Rosa Parks to have to stand, and all that sort of stuff, it just feels a bit more, like the stakes are higher, it feels a bit more real, a bit more urgent, and also, because it's a more recent period of history, only like 60 years ago or whatever, it feels a lot more relevant, I think, basically. And I think with this, just because Pompeii and the Vesuvius eruption and all that sort of stuff happened so long ago, much further back than Rosa and the events of that story, it doesn't quite feel as connected to the present, but yet it's sort of telling you that it is, and sort of making you feel like it should be. It's not a massive problem I have with it, it's just that I think the whole thing of, it's Volcano Day, that whole sort of gimmick is played a little bit more as like a sort of conceptual, fixed point in time thing, rather than something which sort of properly like ties into the whole historical context, if you like. At the end of the day, it's more about the Doctor and Donna. That's what it boils down to, and it boils down to, more than anything else, that justification for having Donna, there in the TARDIS, there to stop the Doctor, to hold him back or whatever, or to hold him to the mark. And similarly, it's about her facing the reality of what life is like in the TARDIS and developing as a character. So, make of those observations what you will. I wouldn't call them criticisms per se. It's just something I noticed this time round. It's something I was a bit less convinced by. I think, again, with this story, visually speaking as well, it's quite bland, quite beige, quite orange, quite red, whatever, the fiery colours. It makes sense to have that sort of colour palette, but it's not quite as sort of bright or visually stimulating or vivid, say, than something like the next story, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And again, from a scripting point of view, this story famously had lots of problems in the scripting process. I think it's essentially like a James Moran script that was spruced up by RTD. But yeah, if you sort of pull the story apart, it is essentially like a series of sequences where, like, the Doctor and or Donna go to, like, visit a certain person or certain people, like the Sibylline Sisterhood, or like when he breaks into that sort of like Mayor Chap's place with the son of Peter Capaldi's character. I think he's called Quintus, maybe, and sort of confronts him as like, what are you up to, what are you doing? And the same with the Sisterhood. And there are a couple of scenes like that where it sort of plays out with the Doctor, like I say, going to one of the bad guys or whatever and saying, what's going on here? And the bad guys don't quite know and don't quite know the answer to what's going on. The Sisterhood, they don't really know what's going on. But yeah, I just think from that point of view, perhaps in terms of the number of villains this story has and the way they're utilised, it's perhaps a little bit confused, a little bit overstuffed with villains, and maybe some of that could have been streamlined. And similar actually for the family of Peter Capaldi's character. They sort of appear quite a lot in the first 2 acts of the story, say, or the first act in particular. And there's that great scene actually set in his house where you have the daughter, I think she's called Evelina, and that Mayor chap. And they're both basically like mind reading the Doctor and Donna and giving these predictions for their future. It has little to do with the story itself. It's more about the series as a whole. It doesn't feel a little bit at that point like the story itself has just sort of ground to a halt, and we're doing some teasing for the finale with the whole thing about, there's something on your back and she's returning and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, aside from that first act, Peter Capaldi's family, those characters don't actually appear all that much right until the very end. Which is a bit of a shame as well, I think, that they just sort of go off the radar halfway through the story and then just crop up at the end, and you're sort of meant to care for them because we've met them earlier. And again, that's an element that I think, if they'd been a bit more present throughout the story as a whole, that might have worked a little bit better, I think, in my opinion, because they are great characters, and it was being nice to see a bit more of them, really. It might sound like I'm trying to rip this story to shreds. I'm really not. I'm just pointing out certain things I noticed this time round which weren't quite as refined as I remembered them being, I suppose. And then finally, for today's video, we come on to Planet of the Ood, the 3rd story of the season, Donna's first trip into the future. And as I was sort of hinting at just now in that previous section, this is a story which I think is a lot more visually stimulating, certainly than Fires of Pompeii. I'm not quite sure how it compared to Partners in Crime from that point of view, but I did find myself looking forward to watching this story. I sort of surprised myself, actually, because it's not a story that I remembered being all that great necessarily, but certainly from a sort of nostalgic point of view, that sort of image of like Ood in the snow is something which works so well, and like I say, I think it is more visually appealing and stimulating and exciting than anything that really has appeared in the series up to this point, I would say. Even without the snow, the Ood themselves are such a fantastic monster, a fantastic design, or indeed monster, if we can even call them that, because they're not really, that's the whole point, isn't it? But seeing them in the snow, seeing them in that little like mock-up advert thing in the opening scene, with that sort of weird like kaleidoscope effect, where there's like loads of them and it's all like distorted and stuff. Love that. It's so great to see them in that context, and I think the story as a whole does really well to sort of develop them further, and obviously showing us their home planet, showing us this system, this society which they've sort of been drawn into, and the way they've sort of been exploited and stuff. It's very harrowing stuff, actually, seeing them in the cages and all that sort of stuff. And I remember that a lot from watching it as a child for the first time as well. Seeing them there, seeing Donna crying at them, and hearing that song on the soundtrack in the background, that sort of voice that appears throughout the story, and that sort of weird reverberated singing sound that also appears quite a few times throughout the story in the background. All of that is just so evocative and works really, really well, I think. And like I say, when I watched it as a child for the first time, it definitely left an impact on me from that point of view. And talking about things that left an impact, I think all of that sort of atmosphere and sort of eeriness culminates in that central image right at the end of Mr. Halpin turning into a nude. I mean, that is just so great. The bit that gets me, because looking back, it is sort of a little bit dodgy with some of the CGI and stuff and effects, but I think that shot of him pulling off his scalp where you can see some of the reddy pinky skin underneath, that to this day remains so gruesome and so eerie and so horrible. And that whole scene, I think I can sort of forgive some of the sort of clunkiness with the CGI and stuff, because definitely what it's going for is something really revolting and harrowing, and it's certainly up there with a couple of other moments from this season, which I'll talk about in future installments of this series, which, as I say, definitely left an impact on the 7-year-old me back in 2008. I mean, one thing that I'm always very aware of when I go back to this story now is that, it's been pointed out by various people over the years that the Doctor and Donna don't play a particularly active role in the story, and they're basically quite passive throughout. They don't sort of instigate anything really, because the plan that's set in motion by Ood Sigma and Dr. Ryder and the friends of the Ood, that all sort of unfolds as planned without any sort of help or interference, from the Doctor and Donna. They just sort of, stand back and watch it happen, for the most part, which, is something which a lot of people have criticised over the years, their sort of more passive involvement or indeed lack thereof in the story. I think in a sense, because I'm so aware of that critique now, it's something which bothers me less and less every time I watch this. And I guess as well, thinking back to what I was saying just now about the Fires of Pompeii, it does certainly tie into that broader idea and sort of broader sort of intention, I suppose, behind his opening stories, in the sense that it's not so much about these worlds the Doctor and Donna are visiting, they're more sort of set dressing, I suppose, to all intents and purposes. And they're set dressing, to those two core central characters, the Doctor and Donna, the developing dynamic between the two of them, and Donna's sort of developing attitudes towards travelling in the TARDIS and the reality of travelling in the TARDIS, and just getting a taste of what that lifestyle is really like. So I think there is a lot to enjoy in this story. I think it probably is a little bit underrated, whereas the Fires of Pompeii is probably a bit overrated. But that said, thinking about it, I'm not sure I'd sort of rank them all that differently to each other, because they are very much, both trying to do the same sort of thing, both, for the characters of the Doctor and Donna, and also for the audience as well, and just in terms of giving them a taste of what the season is going to be like and what Doctor Who is like. I mean, neither of them are perfect stories. I think with this one in particular, just going into a couple of specifics and things, Mr. Halpin as a character, on the one hand, I do like, what Tim McInnery brings to the performance, but on the other hand, it is a little bit hammy, it's a little bit one note, and I think more broadly as well, the sort of just general attitudes of this society, it's a bit one note in terms of how that's presented, and in terms of how the Ood are exploited, and no one really dares question it or anything, or even thinks to question it. But by the look of things, no one really sort of does that apart from the Doctor and Donna. So perhaps that could have been a little bit more nuanced, and the character of Mr. Halpin could have been a little bit nuanced as well. But then on the other hand, it is kind of great that he's presented as this idiot and that he gets his just desserts at the end of the story as well. So I'm sort of in two minds about that. I mean, it's certainly the lasting impression of this story for me is those two things where, the sequences of the Ood in the snow and sort of how harrowing it is when we see the Ood in the cages and stuff as well. And then also it's about that final scene, like I say, the just desserts for Mr. Halpin, where he transforms into an Ood, because that just definitely left a lasting impression when I watched this. So, maybe there's some nostalgia at play there in terms of me sort of perhaps preferring this one to Fires of Pompeii a little bit more this time round. But overall, like I say, I wouldn't say that there's that much difference between them, I don't think. And I think definitely of these three opening episodes, Partners in Crime, by far is the tightest script And some of what makes it work, like I say, it is down to factors sort of larger than the story itself. If it hadn't been Donna, if we hadn't had The Runaway Bride, it would have made nowhere near as much of an impact. But I think because we do have that and all those pieces slot into place and the stars align, it just works so tremendously, and it's such a stroke of luck that all those factors and all those things, converged and allowed it to happen. Those are my views on the first 2 episodes of Series 4 as I've gone back to reappraise them this time round. But what do you think of these stories? Do you agree with my opinions or disagree? Have your opinions of them and your views towards them changed over the years? And indeed, if you were around back in 2008 and watched these when they went out, as I did as well, I would love to hear your memories about that and whether your views on them have changed in the years since. And if you have enjoyed this video, please leave a like, please subscribe if you're new, and let me know in the comments whether you'd be interested in seeing subsequent episodes in this series as I go back and watch the remaining episodes of Series 4. But until the next video, whatever that may be, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye for now.